righty. Welcome to a Cannaconvo episode of Cannabis Last Week, brought to you by Global Cannabis Times. I'm your host, John Puro. Before we get to an awesome interview, I want to note that any opinions I express are my own and not those of my law firm, Zuber Lawler. And I want to do a quick prayer to the video chat gods. May our Wi-Fi connections be sturdy, all dogs and children remain quiet, and may Amazon Prime another time. Amen. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing Robert Beasley, the CEO of Cansortium, which does business as Fluent. And so first of all, just want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule, Robert, to join me and have an interesting discussion about a bunch of issues that covering everything in the industry that jump out at me as very, very interesting ones.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
All righty. So in terms of, topics to discuss, right, in reviewing and understanding, how you joined Cansortium and the story, one of the things I found interesting is, you discussed in another interview, the idea of growth by contraction. And so I was interested to kind of hear in terms of, well, first of all, the timeline of when this happened by comparison to what's happened in the industry overall, and how that process is going, and how that's positioned your company.
Yeah, no problem. And it's really a perspective of the market progress and the development of what was an entirely new industry that kind of caught fire. And it was a rush, a green rush versus a gold rush and so forth. And, my entry into the time period was a little bit at the subsidence of the rush. And so my perspective, at least at Fluent, because I was involved in standing up other cannabis ventures throughout the country, but at least at Fluent is that, they had already ran the race and had claimed their homestead parcels throughout various pieces of territory. The problem is that much like a lot of the other companies, they had bitten off more than they could chew. They had become too horizontally thin, spread out over multiple projects, but with not really enough capital to dig in and invest vertically in any one of them. And so I came into a company that was spending more than it was making. It had not yet developed out a complete complement state that would generate the income needed to support the other projects, and yet was overextended in many, many different ways with these opportunities that did have potential. But the first thing I needed to do was evaluate each of them with a clear and objective, non-personally committed lens. These weren't my projects. I had come in as an advisor. I was objective. And so I got a fresh look, and I wasn't emotionally tied or pot committed, as they say in poker, to any one of them. And so I went by the numbers. What is the cost to finish it? What is the expected ROI? When is that ROI anticipated to start coming in? Can we carry it? And as I evaluated each of them, I had to just let go and not try to save those committed dollars in a lot of ways, because ultimately the company wasn't able to support every one of the efforts. And so everything was on the cutting board. I started with the easy ones. We had a Puerto Rico operation that was failing after the storm. We had quite a few ventures that had potential. And that's the thing about vision and eagerness, is that, vision could be right, but at the wrong time. And so some of those projects could be something one day, but Fluent wasn't going to survive to the one day to get there. And so I basically cut off all the dead ends, let go of that sunk cost, and vertically invested in what I thought was the quickest and highest return. And that was Florida. That was getting 2 more stores opened up in Pennsylvania. The company had an entitlement for 3 stores that only opened 1 out of the 3 available. Pennsylvania was a strong market. And then really evaluating Texas. The only one on the bubble that I worked on was Michigan. Michigan was invested at that time with license renewals already invested, crops already being planted. It felt like the wrong answer, but we were already pretty far down the funnel before I got involved. So we tried Michigan one more go and did our best, produced a great crop, and still suffered from the price volatility that was in that market. That year period of time allowed me to really study the market, understand the dynamics, understand where we fit in or didn't. And ultimately, Michigan was cut as well. I look like somewhat of a profit with Michigan going the way it's gone in the last year or two, but I could only do what was right for Fluent at that time. And what was right was not to be in Michigan anymore. Not that Michigan will not be a great market one day, because it might be. It's just not the way we were situated. It's all about timing. It's about taking an objective look, not throwing good money after bad, and being emotionally detached from some of the economic decision making that's there. It helped that I came in fresh and new, and it also helped that I wasn't part of the green rush when it started.
So many things to unpack there that I love. But first off, I need to thank you. I call this podcast Puro's Persistent Pursuit of Perfect Pot Puns and Awesome Alliteration Acronyms. Pot committed, never used before. So, just as an IP attorney, I'm just going to take that and not give you any credit. Like we'll have to sort it out. No, I'm kidding. But I appreciated that. And, I use the expression efficient allocation of resources a lot. My 8 to 12-year-old daughters don't, they'll come around to it. But as you were saying, I think one thing that's very interesting when you said about Michigan and, the decision that you ended up making there and how it turned out prescient is I think that different markets are coming to terms with this overarching idea, besides macroeconomic factors that, have scaled back on the green rush, as you said, that oversupply is an issue in these markets. And it's very interesting to me when new markets coming in, the regulators don't necessarily, flag, the fact that how it's played out in other states in terms of oversupply. So I thought that was, as you said, a very interesting and wise decision. So in terms of the states, right, where you now, allocated these resources, focus on the vertical, built out as much as you can in terms of the different things that you were entitled to, Florida, Pennsylvania, and Texas. When I saw that those were the 3 states that your company focused on, it jumps out at me. What's the common factor? These are 3 of the biggest dominoes yet to fall in terms of medical crossing over to adult use. But, right, they're very different. Florida has a vibrant over $1 billion, medical market with people's bubbies and zadies down there. I say as a Jewish guy. And then, Texas is obviously very different in terms of, very restrictive qualifying conditions starting to build out. So I was curious to kind of just, dig into each of the states and your thoughts in terms of how you position yourself and how things are going to, play out. So Florida, for example, first, momentum's gathering in terms of the different steps that need to be taken to get it on the next ballot, adult use. And it's so interesting with, the different MSOs there. I'm curious to, know your thoughts in terms of the timeline and how you position yourself and how you found, opportunities in this medical market where there are multiple big players.
Just to back up to what you said on a broader scale, the fact that we remained in 3 medical states that are yet to evolve into adult use was not an accident. There's small blessings in being in a more restrictive market. And so competition is more controlled and more predictable in a medical market than in a rec market because of the means and methods of consumption. And so one of our decisions was to remain in these more limited markets because we needed to step back, get stronger, shore the foundation. And doing so, we needed to be able to compete in what I would call a smaller forum. It's very similar to the states that roll out initially, like we're expecting a word on an Alabama license soon, that don't allow flower. And it's a tragedy to everyone that flower is not allowed. And I get that. But it's actually a little bit of a blessing to us operators because the facilities needed and the processes needed to produce high quality smokable flower is actually a lot more expensive from a capital point of view than to put online a facility that is producing oils for derivative products. And so these little things, while they seem like restrictions from the consumer perspective, if you're trying to grow a business and you're trying to restructure a business, being in a limited market and that which has limited competition because of the controls is actually the right answer, believe it or not. So Florida. Florida has been slow to develop even under the statutory scheme that was provided, and that's because of the political cap and pressure put on it by the governor, who really has accepted this program but does not want to support its growth for reasons that I'm unable to tell you. The Department of Health, which is an executive agency, has really not complied with the statutory rollout scheme of even allowing more licenses. As one that's in versus out, that's been a little bit to our advantage. but it also has allowed a good perspective on what a proper growth looks like. We talked about oversupply. Oversupply is a factor of several things, but primarily the number of competitors in the market. And so with Florida not having a canopy restriction, not having a number of store restriction, it's wide open from a growth side. And so not having a lot of competitors in there all pushing their best and all pushing out, pouring capital into it is going to hedge against that oversupply scenario, which is why we have a good, solid program. The program is going to develop. When it goes adult use is not really an if, it's just a when. There's a constitutional initiative now. I, up until very recently, had been very negative about that outcome from a constitutional scholar point of view. The restrictions and burdens of the discretion given to the Supreme Court post the last amendment has caused a real decrease in certifications. The Supreme Court has already failed to certify this amendment once before. Those corrections have been made. The ballot signatures are there. But in this case, with the funnel so tight through the Supreme Court, it's not really about the ballot signatures. There's no doubt it'll get the signatures. There's no doubt if it got on the ballot, it would pass. The people want it. It's just the process has become more restrictive since last time. Now, I will tell you, I've become slightly more positive about it as I've evaluated it. And so it's a potential that it could go, but I still give it less than a 50% chance, unfortunately. And that's someone who really wants it to happen. Prior to now, we would not have been ready as a company to address that kind of increase in volume. You go from an 800,000 patient population to a standing population of 21 million, within a visitor population of over 80 million, with 56 million of them coming to Orlando to see the mouse. And so you have a massive potential for adult use and probably pushes Florida up to be the number one state almost overnight. And so we're excited about that. We're still not really ready. We only have 32 stores open. We'll be at 36 stores by the end of the year. We're still growing slow. We did borrow the start low and go slow methodology of cannabis consumption with our own business plan. And so we'll be better than we are today and more capable to provide that need. But it's just going to be a barn door opening. It's going to be an overnight doubling, tripling, quadrupling of our business scenario. And we're excited about it. There has to be this timing issue, though. If they do let these 22 in, which they're considering now, then the only relief for the market is going to have to be recreational or adult use, because we're already seeing price compression. We've seen about a 20% drop in single ticket pricing over the last 10 months. Not bad. It was a little high anyway. That's good for the consumer. Competition helps the consumer. But if you continue to pile on supply and demand stays constant, meaning the same 800,000 consumers, then ultimately price drops down, and you get to a price inflection point where it starts to hurt the market in general. That's where we're headed if they let the 22 in, and it times in before the adult use. And so that'll be the thing to watch in Florida is do we fall in line with the Colorados and the Californias and the Oregons and everything and start ending up in an oversupply scenario? I don't know. It'll be dependent on a couple different factors that really aren't connected.
So I think that you touched upon a really interesting topic there that actually is also a good seg to Texas, right? When we're talking about the people want it, right? People want it on a federal level. We're tracking it 2/3, want adult use in all the polls. Florida polls are very, very favorable. And in Texas, right, in terms of covering the pop polls, as I say them, they track with the national average. And yet, my pop on is I call some of these politicians the marijuana betters. And we're starting to see, kind of different tactics sometimes where, a tactic that we're seeing a lot is in the courts, like say South Dakota, right? They pass adult use by ballot and it gets clawed back, in the court system, and I'm curious, to know, do you think that there's at some point where, and you look at the national averages and stuff and you break down the polls, and I like to say, you want to look at conservative grandmas, right? They have a plurality, they don't have a majority yet, and so certain lawmakers, do you think that there is going to be this tipping point where certain lawmakers that are the marijuana no-betters right now say, oh, you know what? This is a win for me, potentially politically. Do you see that point, happening? Do you think that, that could play out in some of these states where, I'm just curious to know your thoughts on some of these tactics and how and when things could shift. Texas, one example is the state attorney general, for example. So I'm curious to know your thoughts about that.
It's really a generational issue, and lawmakers and regulators and law enforcement, they see themselves as the guardian of the people, and from each other and from themselves sometimes. We're not yet the mob that was Rome at one point. We're not ruled by the people's every whim and desire, and legislative process is designed to protect them from what they want, even though what they want is what they want. And so these parties that are obstructing the progress of these bills, they believe in what they're doing. They believe that they're protecting people. And in some ways they are, by putting good legislation in place that allows for a good, solid, medically approved, tested, vetted product to be on the market. And so it is time for the legislatures of these various states to address this issue, because otherwise the people are going to do it, and they're going to do it at a greater and greater scale now, because the cultural barriers to it are starting to decrease. But here's what it takes. It's a generational issue. I grew up with Nancy Reagan telling me just say no, and I followed her instructions strictly all the way until I was 48 years old. And so that generation, my generation and above, they need to see that this isn't what we were told. This isn't a gateway drug. It does have medical benefits. The absurdity of it being on Schedule 1 at this point is just so blaring, when anecdotally now we have thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of good, solid examples of it being a medically beneficial product for many, many different conditions. It's not a cure-all, but for many conditions, it's done. The research is over, and yet it remains on Schedule 1. And so it's just a matter of time. And what I have found is, in southern states, what has to happen is you have to get into the state. You have to get open. This is what we're doing in Texas. We have to get open. We have to provide the products they allow us to provide. We usually have to stay away from that which looks like marijuana or dope, which is typically flower. And we have to show that it's medicine. And then what happens is magic. Usually someone's Aunt Kate, who is a religious Baptist fundamental front pew sitter, tries some for her neuropathy or some kind of condition, and it makes a significant difference in her life. And then the person says, Aunt Kate's not a doper. She's not a drug smoker. She's a pretty decent person, sits on the front pew of the church. And all of a sudden, that it's available to someone else as a benefit, and it's not just recreational, becomes it's like a light going off. And that movement is slow at first, and then it snowballs very quickly. This will happen. This will happen in Texas. It will happen in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Kentucky. Alabama even, it's going to happen. It's just a matter of getting on the ground, getting open. We don't end up with a bunch of junkies sitting in front of our stores, and they don't end up increasing opioid addiction in the state. It actually decreases. All of the things we were told turn out not to be true. And then it opens up. And that's the progress. And you could be positive about it and try to get the data and information out there. And that's what we do. You can't fight cultural concepts and feelings and beliefs unless you do it slowly and with actual facts over time. And that's the progress. Like it or not, that's the path we're going to have to follow.
Everything you say, Robert, I want to jump off in 5 different directions, because it just touches upon you're a like-minded individual. And thank you also for reminding me, when you said the Aunt Kate line, you reminded me of the Steve Miller Band line, right? Aunt Kate, she's not a joker, a smoker, or a midnight toker, right? So it can change people's, conception of the plant and the good. And Schedule 1 controlled substances, you could appreciate this as much as I am. The absurdity of saying that something has zero medicinal value and then carving out CBD that reduces, children's seizures by 80%. It's just, I think you can't point to anything more than the absurdity in that. And so here's, you know, with that pathway that you're discussing in terms of seeing the medical benefit of it and it being a safe and tested product, that leads me to a discussion of this idea of hemp-derived cannabinoids, right? There are these products out there that there's just very little regulation. They're psychoactive products. They are the unintended byproduct of a marijuana better like Mitch McConnell, who caught wind and killed safe banking when we thought we were looking pretty good. They're out there and they're not regulated. And I sometimes feel like the state licensed markets are caught between a rock and a hard place, between the illicit market and the difficulty competing within a price point because of the taxation issues, and the hemp-derived psychoactive cannabinoids that are sold at convenience stores and stuff and aren't subject to regulation, don't have taxation issues. So, I think that this is, you talk about an inflection point. Florida and Texas have had some very interesting things happen in terms of hemp-derived cannabinoids recently. I covered as a golden nugget story on the podcast, in Florida, how there was that proposed bill trying to cap the potency on Delta-8, I believe specifically in edibles, and it ended up being a big contentious issue because the hemp-derived cannabinoid industry is very strong in Florida, employs a lot of people. And so we're now coming up to Farm Bill 2023. I think that this is potentially one of the last and best chances to, regulate on a federal level, Delta-8, Delta-10. I'm curious to know your, thoughts in general in terms of what we might see there, what the relationship of state license is to that side of the market. I mean, as Secretary of the Cannabis Beverage Association, I've seen brands that were state licensed cross over to hemp-derived cannabinoid because of some of these differences. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that issue.
It's an unfortunate scenario where the movement of the people has been suppressed and the lawmakers have not moved quick enough. And so you see this pop-up of this side market, which is gray at best, probably just could go ahead and consider it black. And yet it somehow found a crack in the legislative interpretation to get there. As a business model, I have no issue at all with those reputable companies who are putting hemp-derived cannabinoid formulations out on the market. I feel that their competition level is not so great that it worries us. It doesn't cut into our top or bottom line. The problem I have is that I share a sector with them. My products and their products, from a consumer point of view, the line's a little blurry. And we're in the same sector and we're in the same boat. The difference is one of us is regulated and tested. One of us is inspected often. One of us has incredible scrutiny over what we do, GMP certification, barcodes on everything. The amount of data and tracking and testing we do to protect the consumer is a tremendous cost item for us. And it's pretty strict. I mean, we're in a food grade environment and a pharmaceutical environment. If you go into our facilities, it doesn't look like grandma's kitchen anymore. I mean, it's a totally different world, and they're not doing any of those steps. And so mostly my issue is just one of concern. At best, the consumer that buys the gas station CBD derived product is getting something that's useless. It's not bioavailable, because fixing these molecules in a way that are bioavailable actually takes a little doing, takes a little science, it takes a little equipment. And, that investment is not necessarily always conducted by these competitors in this black market area. We have PhDs, we have chemists, we have testing lab, we have mass spectrometers, we have gas chromatographs, we have all the things you do to make sure that the good stuff is in at the ratios you say it is, and the bad stuff is out. None of that happens on those products. And so the best way to say it is you just have no idea what you're getting, and you do so at your own peril. We have heavy metal monitoring of 106 elements, and I'd like to tell you we never ever get a spike, but we do. Cannabis is a bioaccumulator. When it's in its environment, it seeks out all the bad stuff. I don't know why it does it as a plant, but it's why they're using it at Chernobyl for remediation and other sites. It likes to grab up and accumulate a lot of the ugly stuff that's in our environment. And we have seen it happen in our own greenhouses. We've had an overspray issue from an orange grove a mile away. We've had some soil issues. We got some cocoa in from the Philippines that wasn't clean, and we had some metals. But our system picked it up, and the product was rejected, and the product was disposed of. But without all those lines of testing, you can't see it. You don't see arsenic in the leaf, and you don't taste it, but you ingest it if it's not picked up and disposed of and dealt with properly. I was asked this question in a public forum out in Vegas from one of those industry representatives, what can we do? And I said, get regulated, get on board. Don't go away. Just get yourself regulated. Self-regulate if you have to. Go to the regulators and say, please regulate us, because otherwise you're just not legitimate and you're not safe. And that's my issue with it.
Yeah. I can't agree more, right? One of the stories that jumped out at me as a golden nugget story was, the THCO, when, scientists found that, when combusted, that can produce the same issues as happened in the illicit market, with the vaping crisis a couple of years ago, poking holes in people's lungs.
Right.
Right. And this stuff is out there. And actually it was very interesting because I felt like there's, you saw this batch of states going after Delta 8 and making it illegal. And then there was a pause and the THCO thing came out. And then a couple more states moved on Delta 8 and psychoactive cannabinoids. And I just think that that's a great example to point to where you're like, there needs to be regulation. And recently I covered, some of the hemp groups forwarded their thoughts on what should be in the 2023 Farm Bill, which was interesting. And one I think you'd appreciate was that federal law should preempt state law with respect to certain cannabinoids. And I think you probably can agree that that's not going to happen. But it was interesting in the sense that clearly, like reading between the lines, was, hey, trying to potentially knock out the Delta 8 bans in different states and open up those markets. So but one of the things also they talked about was, regulation, which certainly why it was also, very frustrating when the FDA, after years of us waiting to regulate CBD ingestibles, punted the issue and said, oh, we never had the authority in the first place.
To me, this is the equivalent of the way they're approaching is the equivalent of the spice problem that we've seen. It's a great opportunity to show where there is a legislative need to protect people from themselves, right? But at the same time, they're chasing it much like they were chasing spice. And all they had to do with spice is reformulate quicker than the law could catch them. And they continue to throw these reformulations out. And so Delta 8, Delta 9, whatever we're going to do next, you're chasing it. And legislative process will always be behind chemistry and business because we're working all the time and the legislature has other things to do. And so it takes a while for them to catch it. And so forget about it from that angle. Try it from the other way, which is, this is a cannabinoid, end of story. And let's get it into the Farm Bill where these derivatives off of this cannabinoid are not permitted under the Farm Bill. Close the gap, close the door, and then provide a way that these other entities can get into the system. And who knows, maybe Delta 8 or Delta 9 is the future as a product itself. But we need to get it out of the basements and into the laboratories and understand what we're doing. Again, I go back to, it is not that we are without issue. In our labs and in our manufacturing facilities, we bump into and come across contamination issues all the time. We just have security protocols that catch them. And so I'm not sitting here saying we do it great, they do it terrible, or I'm not even suggesting there might be an issue. There are actual issues. It's just we're catching them, they're not. And that's my only concern. I just do not want to see someone get hurt. It does not have really an economic impact to us. But if something seriously happens, it's going to bring us all down and shade all of what we're trying to do constructively. And someone's going to point to the whole sector and say, see there, drugs are bad. And we should have never let this happen.
I agree. And by the way, I always thought it was so interesting when the vaping crisis happened in 2018. I said to myself initially, first reaction, gut reaction, oh, this is bad, and then I saw how it was spun. And it was, it was the right point. And it's the point that you're alluding to right now. That all happened in the illicit market. Okay. In the legal market, all this testing happens. You don't need to worry about that happening. And that's why I also like it when I see studies that show that in states that go adult use, the teenage consumption goes down. Because when people are getting it through the state legal market, they're not getting it through the illicit market as much. And these routes for, teens to get it decrease. So I think that, you touch upon, some kind of great points there of, we are trying to do this the right way. We are trying to put out great product, and that'll work to the benefit of everyone. And let's try to avoid things that reinforce the stigmas that, as you alluded to much earlier, are all being revealed effectively as BS one by one, right? Anti-pot propaganda, as I say. So, circling back to the different states where your company operates, let's talk about Pennsylvania. Okay, so there was some unexpected progress. I think Dems, just took the state Senate, barely, but they still don't have the state House, I believe. But there's some very interesting proposed bills being put out there when you look at the broader context. So one, the idea of state-run dispensaries. And another one that seems, reminiscent of what's happened in terms of the conditional cultivation market in New York with existing hemp farmers. So I'm, curious to know your thoughts about, how you view the opportunity there. Oh, actually, I also think I read a recent article about oversupply issues possibly in the medical market too. I'm curious to know about your company's approach there, how you think things could, shake out, and, general thoughts.
Well, that's a lot of questions, so I'll try to address
Sorry,
them
I try.
First of all, we are set, ready, financially strong. Our foundation's good. We're ready to expand. We're looking for an operator, or really someone who's caught the bus, is not really understanding quite how to be a good, efficient operator, that needs a good operating partner. And so we've looked at all of these expansion states. We've studied New York pretty well. We've studied New Jersey. The last what you mentioned was the New York development with the hemp farmer roll-in. The hemp farmers throughout the country, they caught in on a wave, and they bought in with both feet, and they needed alternatives in some states, whether it's tobacco alternative or in North Carolina or up in Kentucky where you have tobacco alternatives. And, they bought into it. They jumped into a market that there was 10,001 uses for a product and no one was actually developed it or used it. And so, they all got into a bad situation, and the hemp to convert to cannabis, or to marijuana, if you would, conversion. When I use hemp, I'm not sure what to use as the opposite opportunity, because it's all cannabis. It doesn't know its difference, right? It's only legally defined differently. Those risk takers, they need an entry point to basically salvage their economy. They got in deep. They need something. And if a state is intending to benefit this farmer group by allowing them this rollover entry, then they need to do so. But what happens is that the way it's been done has been a little bit clumsy. They allow all the hemp in, but they allow it in as an afterthought, and then they try to have a full licensing scheme on top of that. And so you end up in this scenario where, again, you've got this oversupply scenario right out of the box. And that's not the way to grow it. You have to titrate out a relationship between supply and demand. And so if there was a desire to benefit the hemp group, then they should have allocated a limited number of licenses for that, and they should have rolled them in and put some restrictions in it, because there was a lot of people jumping in that was a hemp farmer the day before. And so, there was a way to do this, but opening the barn door was not it. And that relates to really just about any way that you try to develop up an initial rollout of licenses. So I think this could be done better. I understand all the political pressures. And I would have been okay with first round was just hemp farmers. Let them get in, stay in. They've already got the capital investment. It's a very short spool up for them to convert. Usually they have to convert from outdoor to indoor. So that's my thought on how to incorporate that. It's really a different scenario, but the same scenario with how clumsily states have been with the social equity issue. States have struggled to get this done, and the problem is that they don't seem to align the social equity opportunity, with the capital demands. And allowing a social equity opportunity in a full vertical scenario where you need $60 million to get it off the ground, Well, that's not equitable at all. That's a license with no actual go forward plan. This is how I roll back around into the state-sponsored store scenario. So the state-sponsored store scenario is meant to be a little bit more of a field leveling measure. It's not necessary. It will not work. The regulatory authorities that have been assigned this tasking are not ready for it. Most of the states, Pennsylvania is probably a leading exception, but most of the states their regulatory departments were handed this job. They didn't ask for it. They haven't yet come up to speed. They don't yet have this funding and the staffing. They don't yet have the ability to enforce. They're not quite ready. They're working off of a learning curve that's still very steep. And then to ask them to now operate and go into business and run stores is just a bridge too far. And it's not going to work. It might have some legs later, but today no one is ready for it on either side. And it's very anti-competitive. There are other ways that the regulatory body can help us, like some of the stuff we've talked about here, be a better enforcer of the rules that exist and let the free market control the rest.
Sitting in here in New York and New Jersey, and what you're touching upon, Pennsylvania, this idea is, I always like to give the disclaimer, I never would want to be one of the regulators. They have a tough job catering to everyone. Their hearts are always in the right place. That being said, it is sometimes a little bit frustrating when, politics dictates policy, right? They're not learning from other states. And when there's something novel, like say the DASNY program, the properties that New York wanted to put in, and then lo and behold, after the application window closes, they remove that requirement. How that didn't result in more lawsuits, frankly, I don't know. But I'm curious to we just got the latest iteration of the proposed regulations 2 days ago in New York with some big changes. You mentioned that obviously as a market that's of interest, financial media capital of the world. I'm curious to know your thoughts in terms of how you think, New York may, shake out, and the opportunity, and whether you want to be patient because there's going to be some hiccups, or it's, how you want to approach the state.
So I'm glad we're not in New York now. This would have been one of those on the cutting room floor for me because it's the way it has evolved from a regulatory and competitive point of view is a little bit awkward, and you're going to have to be pretty strong to stay a while. Having said that, it's a great state. It's a big state. It's a cannabis culturally friendly state. It reminds me of Pennsylvania in many ways. Even the blue collar rates, wages are pretty high. It has some big urban centers, which you like, and it's going to be a good state once it sorts itself out. But there's going to be a lot of losers that couldn't hold on between now and then. And that's the trick, right? Is just not be one of the pioneers that perished on the roadside on the trail. And I wouldn't want to be in New York today. If I were put into New York today, I think we could make a strategy that would work. But it's one of survivability and not really of a tremendous amount of capital investment. I've had the opportunity to look at a lot of companies through due diligence because we have been looking for partners, and the amount of debt that this industry took on in the rush days is tremendous. And sale leasebacks, building facilities in the $50-60 million that are now half operating or one quarter operating. There was a tremendous eagerness and overbuilding of components of this industry and an overborrowing to support that overbuilding. This is the reconciliation period of that. We're coming into that. I read an article that said winter is coming for cannabis, and I think that's the case. But it's not the end of the industry. It's just a reset. It's essentially the entire industry doing what I had to do to Fluent, which is back up 2 steps and contract. This is a natural market, right? We are a commodity market. We're a commodity. We're also a consumer good. And you see markets adjust all the time. My prior life was in real estate development. And, I went through 3 housing booms and bursts and bubbles. And those adjustments are almost kind of healthy and normal and necessary, unless you're the one that gets hit. And you're going to see it. New York's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, and then it will get better.
Yes, and I think it's unfortunate when regulators trying to help a specific population like the hemp farmers end up hurting them in the sense when they're not stores to sell. And we are now at what I call Farmageddon, where people literally bet the farm and are sitting on crop that's going bad and don't have the money to put seeds in the ground for the next, grow season. It's quite unfortunate. But so you
And the
alluded
failure
to
to
something.
recognize, these later states coming on, I've been in the legislative bodies of several states that are working on their statutes, and the hubris of just not taking a minute and looking around at what other states have done is pretty amazing to me. They all seem to operate in a vacuum. And if you're a later state to this market, you don't need to be so blinded or with blinders on. You could just take a peek. What happened in the hemp industry in overall happened first in Oregon and California, and then it spread to the east. And it wouldn't, the eastern coast, southeastern even regulators have no excuse. They have now 30 something examples of how to do it right or wrong, and they could cherry pick if they wanted to. And that's what I suggest they do. But it's so odd to me how they start from scratch every time.
I think it's a function, right, of, like I said, politics guiding policy. I always point to, if you're trying to compete with the illicit market and have people cross over, being able to compete on price is such an important thing. And you have the built-in disadvantage of 280E. So I always point to, Chuck Schumer's, draft, legalization bill that was never going to go anywhere. But the idea of a ramping up tax rate. So you could compete politically, so you could compete price-wise best you can right at the beginning of the launch of, say, an adult use market. But politicians, I think, typically want to be able to say, all right, I moved on this. If I legalize this legislatively, look at all the tax revenue coming in from the high taxation on the state level. But you're handicapping the industry from the beginning, to get to that healthy point. Before we wrap up, I think that you were starting to allude to something very interesting with respect to New York and how you might potentially play it, which was, I think, and something I help people with as a trademark geek, right, is the idea of perhaps you're saying an asset light, license light, IP licensing models. And, you have, I notice, of course, your own brands that you have in your stores. And I'm curious if that was part of the idea. And also, I found it very interesting when looking at your brands. And I always talk about the connoisseurs and the canna-curious. And I noticed particularly with respect to, say, the vape brands, you have Blackline, which seems like it caters towards the connoisseurs, and Moods, which is an effects focused brand that's more accessible to the canna-curious. So I'm curious to know your approach to the brands and everything, and is there some angle there that you explore strategically in terms of the development of the company?
So branding has been quite the journey for this company, and it's because we are primarily born out of a very restrictive regulatory market as far as advertising and logoing and such. Florida is white box, white label, no colors, no art, nothing. And so when you have a California out West Coast brand, what is a brand? Well, a brand is some combination of color, pattern, scheme, design, slogan, logo associated with a product. Well, when you cut out all of those elements of that association, you don't have much left. And so we have, I've broken the hearts of quite a few California brands that have been very successful by saying there's really no place for you in Florida because I can't do anything with your name. I can't use your fancy colors and logos. I can't do anything. So I have rejected the offers of brands that are just a name and a sticker on a box. Now, if the brand is tied up to associated with a device, a product, a formulation, something that is more than just a sticker on a box, anybody's box, then it does have legs and it does have room to develop. The concept around the brand, the thing, the pattern, the formulation, the product, that has value. And so we have sought relationships in those directions because then what I'm doing is I'm getting their product on our shelf, not their sticker. And we will continue to follow that pattern. We are not interested. We grow good weed. We make great edibles. We make an elixir. We make a tincture. We make a cream. We make it all. And so someone coming in to say, try our edibles, I say, try ours. And now you want to bring me something new, something different, something that's red hot, that isn't something we do or know how to do, because we don't know how to do everything. Then we have something that goes with the brand, because what we're really talking about for our purposes is the royalty, not the brand. It's how much they want to charge us to put their sticker on our box, and then what value do we get? And because we're in limited advertising scenarios, we don't get any value with name, logo, whatever. They have to give us more so that we can have a discussion about branding, and we're going to maintain that position. I do not have confidence that there's a direct translation from the West Coast to the East Coast on branding. I do not have confidence. I know for a fact that if I put high quality flower on our market, in our shelves, it sells for the same dollar amount, and I don't care what you call it. It's about the quality. It's about the product. The name is secondary. And I think Cookies is testing that out, right? They're a pure franchise model at this point, and they're very successful where they have good product. They're very not successful where they have bad product or mediocre product. And so ultimately, the sticker is just the sticker.
Yeah, and when it comes to Canada stores, I completely agree. I remember having Chris Beals, Weedmap CEO, I mean, at the time, come on, and he said for, the hardcore Canada stores, brand is not one of the top 5 considerations. So, I mean, 100% in line. We could talk for hours. It's been a lot of fun, but I want to wrap everything up on time.
Okay.
So, Robert, I just wanted to thank you so much again for joining. It was fascinating hearing you talk about all these different topics. So thank you for taking the time.
Okay, great. Thank you for having me on.